Here to speak about Gaia-X compliance and label, we have the CTO of Gaia-X, Christoph Sternadl. Oh, no. We're going to start with Roland.
1, 2, 3. Yeah, I can explain. Yeah, good morning, Christoph Trunadl, the CTO of Gaia-X. And contrary to normal IT behavior, or often encountered IT behavior, where you have the requirements engineers, the Rolands, the COOs, starting with their work on one part of the spectrum and looking, I don't know, from a vantage point to IT implementation, then coming up with the compliance document in our case, throwing that over the fence, asking me and the other IT guys, including Pierre, to solve all the riddles that they have presented to us, to implement it, and then just send an email, a text message completed, LOA released. That's the ideal situation. It has been called waterfall, and did it work? Did it ever work? What we present, and this is a different approach we did for the LOA release, it was more of a tandem, a co-evolution, a co-development, and how that works, and why it's still, maybe it's that microphone,
yeah.
And maybe why it still needs to start at the business end. This is what we are going to present, not in a real, you know, in Austria we had the Doppelkonferenz, a double stand-up comedians, and the difference between Farkas and Waldbrunn, if you know them, and us guys, in Farkas and Waldbrunn, there's always one smart guy and one kind of imbecile, moron, who doesn't get it. That's not sufficient for Gaia-X. So I hope we are two smart guys, but I'll leave that to you to judge. Starting with Roland.
Thank you, Christoph.
I will watch him actually. And that is one of the things I have not been able to do, to look into the POC, because sometimes technology can do things which the business people do not yet know. For instance, this verifiable credential stuff, this private key infrastructure that's essential as the engine for conveying trust. You do not need to know how it works underneath, but this is kind of the offer sometimes IT makes to Roland.
Thanks. So I would like to start with the press conference this morning. There, where the first question we got is whether Gaia-X produces papers, and if those papers ever become real. And I think this is the first thing we need to make clear. We did produce papers because there is a need for requirements and business applications. But those papers then we hand over to people like Pierre and Christoph, and together with the OSS community, they put those requirements into code, and then I get it back and I put it to the clearinghouse providers for operationalization. And I think that is a huge difference between what Gaia does and what other initiatives tried to do in the past. So on the business perspective, I'd like to follow up on a slide that Ulrich just showed, and a different perspective on this one. I get the question very often, do we really need to exchange data? Do we need data spaces, and isn't that dangerous? And I can tell you that decision the industry has taken probably 60 or 70 years ago. In the 50s, an automotive provider, an OEM, produced a car with components delivered in a radius of about 300 kilometers maximum. Today, we all know that OEMs produce their product maybe at 20%, 80% comes from suppliers, but they're not simple suppliers, they are actually partners. And if you want to create a digital twin of such a high-end product like a car, or even bigger, like we had this morning with Catherine, an airplane with, what was it, 2 million parts, you better have insight in what your suppliers do. Now, I want to start on a very basic example, because sometimes I get the question, what is it? And if you want to explain it, or I need to explain it, I have a very simple example. Many years ago, a lot of countries agreed that their citizens can travel among the different countries. And then they said, but if we do so, we need some kind of rules. And one of the rules was, well, probably should be able to identify those people. So they came up with the idea of passports. And then they said, yeah, but passports need to have certain qualities. We call it criteria. So they said, okay, we should have a picture, we should have a birth date, maybe they should expire at some point in time. Later on, they said they need to be machine readable, and now again picking up on globalization, an OCR code need to work everywhere in the world. So you need to have different characters than we do. And then they came up and said you need to have biometric data, and now you have a chip on it that can be read everywhere. 3 weeks ago I was in Japan with Ulrich, and I mean, they just take my passport, they can read it. And what they created basically is a trust framework. That's the same thing we do for data. So the trust framework is the same thing that countries did for passports and free travel. That's exactly the same thing. You understand who is delivering the data, how, and if there's any additional contracts, like you need a visa or you don't, or you can use the data. How the passport is created in a country actually is something that is in the country's authority. And the same is true for how you're going to establish credentials that are allowed to work within the data space. That's called the Data Space Governance Authority. And then in country, you might have additional options you can do with an ID, especially digital ones. I am from Austria. We have a digital ID where I can use as, for example, as a driver's license or for the registrations of my vehicles. And these are things that also decided inside the data space, like inside the country. So with that, I think it's a good way to understand what trust actually enables. Now, when we talk about data spaces, we have a few of them here. The problem is that when you look inside one, and I just take automotive, then it was originally built along use cases inside that vertical. So it was between the OEMs and tier 1, 2, 3, yada, yada, yada. But in Europe, we all know we have this trend to go to electric vehicles. So all of a sudden, energy, grid and network providers become an important element of your data space. So if those two have their rules and they work perfectly fine inside, they have the first problem to build that ecosystem across. And then when you think about electric vehicles, when it comes down to smart cities are actually a multi-layer of data spaces that do not belong to that city because they come from different sources. And so there is a dilemma how to solve it. And we don't try to solve the entire world, but what we try to do is we try to get a common denominator that allows each different vertical to communicate between each other to realize cases that are between those different data spaces. So is it everything you share outside? No, it's probably parts that you can share if you're just a Gaia-X participant. Maybe you need to sign digitally an additional document to use more of the data space, and most likely there will be parts on those data spaces that you cannot access if you're not a member of that club. So how are we getting to those documents and to this implementation? So how do we get from policies to production? Because that's part of my job in operationalization. So first, the community creates two kinds of documents. One is a compliance document, which is completely tool agnostic, and one is an architecture document that is completely rule agnostic. That is basically, in ITIL terms, the design phase. Then we take this into a build phase where the community build the Gaia-X releases, e.g. Loire, the version that we are launching at this very event. So that's the build phase. And finally, we hand it over to the service providers, and there can be theoretically an unlimited number of service providers who are running those digital clearinghouses. And those digital clearinghouses, there was also a question this morning, they are truly federated, so they talk to each other in the background. So even if I'm in a single data space, I can have 3 different clearinghouse providers that issue verifiable credentials. And this is how we go into run phase, and that's how we operationalize the framework. And the last concept I would like to explain is, what is it that makes Loire so different from Tagus? In Tagus, I basically signed that I'm going to be a good corporate citizen. I will obey the rules. Here it is different. Now what we did is we said there is standards that are, for many criteria, there is existing standards that describe and can certify for these criteria. So what we do is we said, what evidence would you need to present an auditor, for example, that they say, yeah, you are adhering to a certain cybersecurity criteria. So this is what we did. So in the first, read it as a column, you have policy. That's what the policy and rules documents say. It's a criterion. The second thing is ontology. So how are we going to present it? So we find the permissible standards, most likely more than one, like BSI, Secnum Cloud, ISO, and we see what evidence you need to present. And sometimes which validation method, and then it goes into the digital clearinghouse and they validate what you presented. So for example, if you present an email address, it validates that it's a valid email address. And if all is true, they're gonna issue a Gaia-X label. So this is the simple case which we already could do. And now we also introduced level 2 and level 3. And let's just focus on the lower color, on the lower row now. Now you present your certificate. And what we are doing in the clearinghouse is we see if that particular standard is a permissible standard to prove that you meet a certain criteria. Secondly, we look up if the auditor that, or conformity assessment body in our terms, that signed that is actually accredited for that standard. And finally, if the signature is valid. And if that is all true, the clearinghouse will issue either a Gaia-X label level 2 or level 3, whatever you are trying to get. And I think this is really a game changer, because one side effect it does is, if, for example, a large company like Airbus says, I need certain services across Europe in 3 or 4 countries, then you don't need to figure out what's the actual standards in those specific countries. You can say, I need a Gaia-X label level 2, and French companies may be able to prove it through a Secnum Cloud certification. Germans will do it through a BSIC 5, but it's the same Gaia-X level 2.
I have one short interruption. That's the business kind of level, the business description of what we're trying to achieve. Technically, I have one slide because that's an interesting new part, what we have really been doing also in terms of standardization. So the documents we are talking about are really standards or specification. There is a really an interesting twist when we try to automate what Roland has just been doing. So the tech is also interesting, coming back to Ulrich and Klaus, inviting everyone to participate. So it's not just the functional requirements which require your input, but also the technical side is really, I would say, cool maybe, but I'm the wrong person. I'm too old for cool.
Okay, so the next one really ties into that. Remember the X, we had infrastructure, we had data up. We have a little bit of more differentiation now. We have down there the Gaia-X infrastructure labels, which we have already completed. And the next level is the minimum interoperability credentials, or if you want, a participant ID, which at the moment is part of the lower part. But we will carve it out in our next release because it can be used for multiple purposes. The infrastructure is simply saying you are compliant to the Gaia-X infrastructure rules. They're all basically linked to existing standards, so nothing fancy, nothing new, but you have to prove it, and it's fully automated. Then you have the participant ID, which will come up next, and then we are working on the trust protocol specification, where I'm sure that Christoph will say something about, and then there will be a lot of stuff in the tech theater, and it allows you to implement different controls that are industry specific. So you need something special. And I take an example from Martin, one of our board members, with EDF. When you process certain data that is on nuclear power plant or related to it, it must not leave France. So if you implement the rules on the top, and you also have the infrastructure labels on the bottom, imagine they're running this on a data center in Paris. For whatever reason, the data centers in Paris has a problem and initiates a failover. If that failover, according to the rules, is possible and it moves to Toulouse, the service will continue to run. If the failover forces the cloud service provider to move to Ireland, the service needs to stop. And this is one simple example that you can implement by this multi-layer approach of sovereignty controls, because that is not a black and white switch. It is really something that helps you to define your business requirements. And also here, my big ask to you, if you are part of an industry vertical, if you work on the business side of the show, if you work in projects, please join us in the Policy and Rules Committee. It sounds a bit dry, but it's a lot of fun. And we cannot develop the correct set of rules that support your business if you don't help us understand your business. The worst thing we can do is create rules that don't support your business, because that would just be overhead. Christoph.
Yeah, now it's my time to take over, and I have, because being the CTO, I have automated some parts of the automation, but I have not completely automated it away, so I'm not a chatbot. What you see in the back of me is, of course, well known, but from a CTO perspective, and also from an adoption perspective, one crucial element is missing. And this is, of course, the specifications, but after the specifications, after you have solved on paper, what is missing still from a CTO perspective or adoption perspective? And that's the software for automating. We are talking about automating trust. Also, Pierre is giving a panel after me. So the key question is, if we really start with the compliance in the Policies and Rules Committee, what is the process looking like to arrive at a decent implementation? And I kind of will lead you through the journey. I'm not going into all the details. One technically interesting part is that we now implement and automate also certification. So it's not just you declaring that you're a good citizen and you have never got a speed ticket. Now you have to go to an external compliance assessment body, which is a testing, like a TÜV for ISO 9000, which is testing and declaring whether you fulfill some requirements or not. And the interesting part was to do that electronically. And how do we automate that process? And the easy part is a translation, or is that an easy part? I don't know. I leave that to the team and Pierre to decide. One way how to do it, or the first way we did it, was translating. This is the PDF document, or actually it's a web document to be exact. How would we translate that into code? And the difficult part here was that you need to come up with machine readable, with a machine interpretation which is not ambiguous. And this is called ontology. You have to implement it somewhere. But this is the new part to a certain degree. And it needs a close collaboration between the people on the left side and the people in the CTO team. And initially, if you go to a informatic study, if you do that, then there is a single role which would fulfill that. And that's the business analyst. If you try that in a very, very complicated setting like ours, where you have a lot of norms and domain-specific rules to obey, and you have a lot of new different technologies, it's not a single person who is able to translate it. It was a team effort. And Judith and many of you know the players, Evan and the Gaia-X lab team, they were instrumental, and it was a back and forth. It was a co-development, actually, and not a single, I implement a specification. And actually a similar exercise we leave to you, because if you want to start up an ecosystem, you need to do something similar, but this is part of the economic theater to go into more details. You need to do the similar co-development and co-evolution with your ecosystem partners. Once you have that, this kind of intermediate representation, it takes good developers, very good and excellent developers, and a little bit of back and forth, and a little bit of interesting technology stuff, like graph databases, to implement that. And then, and only then, you have runnable code for the compliance service, which is ensuring, which is of course enacted and running at the Gaia-X Digital Clearinghouse, and ensuring that the certificates you got are valid. One of the interesting parts which we implemented actually for the first time, I think, is if you normally go and look for your ISO certification. You are a service provider who wants to certify, I don't know, your product, your service, your IT department. You go to TÜV Nordrhein-Westfalen. Unfortunately, I don't know the Finnish conformity assessment body, but you submit something to be tested, which is called the object. So that could be you, your software, your organization. And normally you would expect in the digital area to get back an electronic certificate or an electronic certification, a verifiable credential, which you immediately could plug into your wallet, your other IT systems. This, unfortunately, is not implemented today. This is the future. Maybe in 1, 2, 3 years, you will be able to select different assessment bodies, whether they support that. If that's not happening today and you want to adopt it, how would you still come to an electronic representation of the PDF which you have got? Maybe it's a signed PDF. How would you still be able to electronically automate the whole chain? Because that's the point of the trust, that if you have many to many, thousands to thousands communication, you will not be able to manage the trust verification manually. And the idea is, even if you get back a signed PDF or a paper, a letter by snail mail, you will have to make use of notaries, and those will check that and provide an intermediate kind of step, maybe manual. It's a service, so we don't care. And only then you get back the electronic certificate, which you put into your service credential, and everything can be verified electronically. So that, of course, is also a business model for the notaries, for the clearinghouses, in order to provide this type of intermediate services. Honestly, I expect that in the future, you won't need any notary any longer, so they will become unemployed, because every conformity assessment body will have and will issue electronic signatures. That's my hope, but in the meantime, we need to provide working solutions. And the interesting technology part here is that this standard, how do you send back for every conceivable certificate we have included in the compliance document? How do you make sure that this is really the passport interface working in every domain? And this is what we are standardizing actually in the Eclipse Database Working Group. PI is instrumental in defining that so it works. It also needs notaries, of course, so this is also an organizational question, not just the technology questions, which is when I come back to Roland for looking for them. One last slide related to the outlook. If I have the digital clearinghouses, they are the origins of trust. But where would the business really happen when we exchange trustful data? It would be between service providers and service consumers, or data providers and data consumers. But what would they need in order to participate in such a trusted ecosystems? Of course, you start with the credentials. I don't have to tell you that. So the architecture diagram is a little bit of loose, so come to me if you want an ontology for that. You also have, of course, you want to have that also as service consumers, the same type of credential. But what else do you need in order to consume a service? And I have used a little bit a different coloring, personal machine credentials, because this is not something which Gaia-X can define, standardize alone. Many of you are aware of EIDAS 2, so the new regulation about personal credentials, about organizational credentials. What about machine identities? So we are putting that on our roadmap 2025 to come up with a solution, with one single solution to rule them all. At least this is the aspiration, because we don't want to have on a global level, so I'm not just talking about the EIDAS, and with the trust anchor model, you can do that actually, but we need to work together and find our sweet spot and the interfaces to the other ecosystem participant and standardization bodies. That's part of the road mapping exercise Klaus has been introducing. And that was highly interesting, so I welcome anyone to work on that. And if you have that, and if you have a service realization, so someone providing an AI service, a chatbot, and I don't know, an IoT platform, what would that service provider need in order to capitalize on the trust which originated from the digital clearinghouse? It would be something like a rules engine for verifying the identity of the service consumer, for verifying other claims. And this is also something where partly the standards have already converged or are converging, but you still need software implementations. And this is where I will spend a lot of energy with the team in order to sort out, to be able to pinpoint and to tell everyone upon request which type of software implementation of our standards would we recommend, would the community recommend to be able as a service provider and a consumer to make really live productive use of the trust framework. Maybe you also need a compliance checking service on both sides if you don't trust these parts. But this adoption-related topic will keep me awake in 2025. And with that, because we need to solve that, and with that, I give back the final words to Roland. If you have not eliminated that, because we were streamlining the application.
Yep.
Sorry.
Just click on it. Yeah, I just want to, it's just a quick summary. Where we said what we discussed today from a business perspective as well as from technology was the challenge trust between parties and participants is actually realized through the clearinghouses. The access to high quality data is realized through the architecture and the trust framework. The need for a trustworthy ecosystem is actually what we're all here for. It's the ecosystem and interoperability that starts with trust and goes on with the standards of data exchange and this OpenID Connect activities that we're driving. And finally, the global legislation challenge is something we started with European levels and data exchange policy enforcement, but we're bringing forward to, at the moment, Japan, Korea, and others. And I think with that, we can conclude and let's say, let's make data sovereignty real together.
Thank you for your attention. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Christoph and Roland.